Hey there, I'm Kyle Brotherson with Dirt Bike Channel. Today we're talking about the Husky TE 250i and the KTM 250 XCW TPI. These are both fuel injected bikes. I'm going to tell you my thoughts about which one I like better. Stick around. To get you guys up to speed, the KTM 250 XCW TPI is a bike that I bought, and the Husky over here is a bike that was loaned to me from Husqvarna, so thank you for doing that. The reason why I bought the KTM is because it was the one that was the most readily available. I contacted multiple dealers and said, hey, I want your first either KTM or your first Husky that comes through the door that's the fuel injected one, and the KTM was the one that was the first that was available to me, and so this is the one I bought. And then Husqvarna was gracious enough to let me borrow this bike for about a month. And that month is kind of closing up here in January, so I'm doing some reviews and talking about the two different bikes and my experience on them. I've put more hours on the Husky than I have on the KTM because it's just been hard to find the time to do the riding. And right off the bat, I wanted the tests when we rode the bikes back to back, I wanted them to be as fair as possible. So I needed to set the bikes up as closely as possible as I could. Now, the bike from Husky came with some aftermarket parts on it. They did an FMF header pipe, they did an FMF exhaust. Those were the main performance upgrades. The other things, they put on some breakaway levers and they put some bling around on the bike, but and they put like a rear disc guard on here and a couple of things. But as far as performance goes, the only modification that they did was they put the pipe on this bike. Well, that meant that I needed to put the pipe on this bike. So I went through and I put an FMF header pipe on this bike and the FMF exhaust on the KTM to bring it up to the same level as far as the exhaust wise goes to the Husqvarna. And then I was like, okay, so the Husqvarna had the MX3S motocross style tires. I think it's because the reviewers that did this before me were using it on a track. And because they come with Dunlop AT81s, both bikes. So now I'm sitting there going, I've got to put the same tires on them. So I opted to just go with some Bridgestone Battlecross X40s, and I put brand new tires on both bikes. So brand new Bridgestone Battlecross X40s on both bikes. I went through and I checked, I've got a list. I checked clickers, made sure the clickers were all set to the standard setting on both bikes, all the way through compression rebound on the forks and shock. I made sure that they both had skid plates. I put a rear disc guard on both the bikes. I'm just looking off my whiteboard over here. They both got pipes. I set the sag to the exact same. I set it to where I had 100 millimeters of sag when I was standing up on the bikes and 105 millimeters of sag when I was sitting. So they were both the same that way. I moved both of the bars forward in the triple clamp so it felt natural to me. I adjusted the power valve so they were the exact same spec. I think I ended up with like one turn in from flush on both bikes. I adjusted handlebar tension. I set my controls up. Obviously I already went over the tires. And so we set the bikes up. I set the bikes up as closely as I could to see which one I liked better. Now, I try to go into any one of these tests when I'm riding bikes back to back. I try to go in with an open mind, but everyone always comes into something like this with a little bit of biases. And I figured that I was gonna like the Husqvarna better because the Husqvarna has that linkage shock on the rear. And I'd ridden the Husqvarna multiple times more. I'd ridden the Husqvarna about 2 or 3 times as much as I had ridden the KTM when we went and did a ride day where we rode them back to back. And we rode these bikes. I had 4 or 5 riders with me, and we just kind of did a round robin, swapping back and forth on these bikes and with some other bikes, with some other another carbureted KTM and an EFI 4-stroke KTM. And it was just really, really eye-opening for all of us to kind of go through, because all of us felt like we were going to like the Husqvarna better going into it just because it had that linkage suspension. And all the other guys, and you'll see in other videos, I don't know if I'm gonna have those other interview videos up before this one or not, but all of the guys actually ended up liking the KTM better. And they were all super surprised. And they just felt a little bit more stable and a little bit more planted on it. For me though, I wasn't so sure. I think that to me, both bikes were so incredibly similar that I felt it was like splitting hairs. In a way, I felt a little bit more comfortable on the Husky, but it was just such a razor thin difference between the two, because they have the same forks, they have the same gearing, they have the same engine, they have slightly different subframes. You know, the Husky has more of a composite subframe, whereas the KTM has an aluminum subframe. They have a little bit different air boxes, but as far as the way that they ran, there was a very, very slight difference in the way they ran, and I think it just came down to pipe, because the Husky didn't maybe seem to have quite as much low end, and I think that's basically just because it's got a motocross pipe on there. It's got the FMF factory pipe on this thing with the Power Core 2 silencer, and I think that's more of a motocross setup, whereas on the KTM, of course, I wasn't gonna, I wanted to upgrade the pipe, but I didn't want to go with a factory pipe. I didn't want to go with a motocross pipe, so I went with the FMF gnarly torque and then the Power Core 2 spark arrestor, so it would be Forest Service approved on the bike that I own. This one seemed to have a little bit more low end, the KTM, whereas the power on the Husky came in the mid-range and then the top end. But it was super, super subtle differences in the way that the power came on with the bikes. And I loved both of them. They both scream. They both have amazing throttle response. They both run as clean as you can possibly imagine. They both run as good as any two-stroke I've ever been on. And they were phenomenal. And I didn't feel like there was enough of a difference in really any situation that you'd go wrong with either of these bikes. They were so much more similar than I figured that they would be. The KTM with the PDS suspension here, all of us thought it would suffer in the whoops and the faster stuff out in the desert, but honestly it didn't. The funny part was Tyler, one of my riding buddies, he bought a 2017 KTM 300XC, and he also bought a 300XCW. Those are both 2018 models. He bought a W for his dad. So he had the same bike, one with linkage and one with the PDS, and he doesn't like the 300XCW as much as his XC. But then when he got over to this bike, it blew him away, because this bike, he still felt super comfortable on it and didn't even notice that it had the PDS. Maybe that's a setup thing, I don't know. But what I'm saying is the PDS was not a problem for me on this bike. It was phenomenal. If you told me that I had to ride either one of these bikes, you know, for the rest of the year and not touch any other bike, I'd be totally fine with it. Both of these bikes were flippin' amazing. I can't stress enough how good KTM and Husky did with their first iteration of these EFI two-strokes. They are very, very good. Neither one of them wants to start really well when it's super cold. And when I say super cold, like 20 degrees outside, you pretty much have to kickstart them. I know that you can, like, you know, crank on it a little bit for 5 seconds and let the batteries warm up. I've done all that stuff because the lithium ion batteries don't really like to start when it's super cold like that. But cranking speed, it wasn't the issue. The batteries had plenty of torque. It's just that these things need to be kicked over even faster, and I've been able to do that with the kickstarts on both bikes. So they both have the same quirks that I don't like. Actually, the Husky has a crappy kill switch, whereas the KTM has a kill button, so I like that better on the KTM. Both of them have problems with leaking out of the oil cap up here with your two-stroke oil. So they kind of have a couple of little nitpicky things, but I couldn't really tell enough of a difference between the two bikes where I would be like, oh, you should buy one over the other. My thought is this: buy the one that is the best deal. Where I live, the Husqvarnas are less available, they're harder to find, and they're usually $200 or $300 more than the KTMs, which is why I just stuck with the KTMs, because these bikes are already, as you know, expensive enough. I don't want to pay extra just to have the white and blue bike. Although there are less guys that are running these things out there on the trail, so if you want to be a little bit different, I would say go for the Huskies. As far as the air boxes go, people complain and say that they need to like vent their air boxes and everything. I honestly don't think that is needed at all. Neither one of these bikes feel like they're plugged up to me. I know they have closed off the air boxes a little bit more, but I don't think it matters for 99% of the people riding these bikes. They're getting enough oxygen to run these motors really well. And yeah, they might be tuned a little bit differently. The Husky might be tuned a little bit more, you know, for a little softer on the bottom end in some cases. I think that's probably by design. But no, I don't think you need to like vent your airbox on either one of these bikes. They both scream straight out of the box. So as far as which one I like better, you're gonna see the other riders that I have test, you know, that I interviewed. They pretty much all felt more comfortable on the KTM, which was weird. They all were surprised by that. But for me, it wasn't that big of a difference. The Husky is 7 pounds heavier. The way that this is outfitted, and I tried to do, you know, do as fair of a test as I could just by filling them up with gas. The Husky was about 7 pounds more than the KTM, but you didn't feel that. Honestly, you couldn't tell when you were riding these things, you couldn't tell that there was any difference in weight. And they both felt lighter than my 2017 KTM 250XC, which this was like 14 or 15 pounds heavier, whereas this one was about 7 pounds heavier than that bike. But both of these bikes felt incredibly light, and they felt lighter than my carbureted 2-stroke. So I think that these bikes and the bikes that will follow are going to save 2-strokes, because people are going to actually find out for the first time what a 2-stroke is really supposed to run like, because they run phenomenal, and people are going to be blown away with them. And that's exciting, because I think it'll help, you know, invigorate the resurgence of 2-strokes, and it saves them because we were going to lose 2-strokes because of emissions. Anyway, so those are some of my thoughts. I loved both the bikes. It's too hard for me to pick between which one I'd rather own, because they're just that good. They both have a couple little things that are maybe better than the other one, but overall, when you boil it all down, and I was riding these things back to back all day long, it didn't matter which bike I was on. I loved them both, and there wasn't a deal breaker, you know, with either one. So. These are both great bikes. The Husky TE 250i, awesome. The KTM 250 XCW TPI, this one really surprised me. This one probably surprised me more than this one. I'd have either one as my primary bike, and I would just love it. So anyway, those are my 2 cents. Thanks for tuning in, guys.